In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. It's been a difficult week or so because of all of the problems to do with racism, the ongoing problems with coronavirus and the economic difficulties that people are facing. And when we come to today's readings, I feel very ambivalent about them. The first reading is about Abraham and Sarah and the miraculous conception of Isaac when Abraham's 99 and Sarah's 10 years younger. And Abraham and Sarah are generally seen as, heroic, historic figures who are Abraham's the father of many nations. But there's something about the story of Abraham which is quite unpleasant. I mean, first of all, when Isaac's born, before Isaac's born, they take advantage of Sarah's slave girl, Hagar, and effectively Hagar has to become sort of an enforced concubine. And then when she conceives and bears Ishmael, who traditionally is the father of the Arab nations, she's then persecuted by Sarah when Isaac's born. And so you've got this sense of this person who is the father of all these people, and his wife Sarah, who are in themselves deeply flawed characters. I mean, we've been thinking a lot about slavery in the last weeks and the effects of that over time. And we cannot look at Abraham and Sarah without actually thinking about that aspect of their lives as well. Now, there's something about Judaism and the Jewish tradition which is based upon, let's say it, the idea of race, because Judaism is an inheritance. And when Christianity came along, Paul, as we found out in our second reading, was struggling with the implications of that, because you had up to this point this dichotomy between Jews on one hand and Gentiles on the other, and if to put it bluntly, it's racist. And one of the things that's going on at the moment is how do we bring together black, white, other races in a way that honours everybody, acknowledges the faults and failings of the past and the present. And don't get me wrong here, I am deeply concerned not just about institutional racism, which we've heard a lot about since the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, but also about cultural racism. One of the things about being white, middle class, middle-aged and all the rest of it, and male, is that I personally have been born into privilege, and that makes it very difficult to speak in an unbiased way about those whose daily lives are lived in fear that they might just be arrested and locked up for no apparent reason other than that they're black. So with that in mind, it's useful to think about how in Jesus' day Judaism was a dominant culture. It was very confident in itself. It felt as though it was superior to the rest of the world. And part of the rest of the world's response to that occasionally was to try and wipe Judaism off the map. And that sense of we'll get our own back is something that lies behind, say, the Maccabean crisis. And of course, that's not the way to go either. So with all those caveats in mind, it's what I'm trying to get to today is what Jesus actually did for that problem. And what he did was by personal sacrifice. He died, he gave up his life in order to bring together Jew and Gentile. Now, when we look at the gospel reading, we see this very strange instruction from Jesus to the 12 disciples: don't go to the Gentiles, go only to the Jews. I think what he was doing was being prophetic. Remember, there were 12 disciples, and this is not a convenient bureaucratic thing. He's actually being prophetic. It's symbolic of going to the 12 tribes of Israel. But what Jesus always had in mind, I think, was that his message, his love, his life would spread out beyond the people of the house of Israel. And he did indeed go to Tyre and Sidon and did briefly go outside the confines of Israel. And I think it was inevitable that within a year or so, Christianity would spread out beyond the bounds of Judaism, and indeed that's what happened. And by the time you get to 40 years later, 70 AD, and the destruction of Jerusalem during the Jewish wars with Rome, the break is made, and Christianity becomes a religion in its own right. So what does that mean today? Because we have to bear in mind that Christianity itself has behaved very badly to its Jewish cousins. Things like the Holocaust during the war was done under the guise of so-called Nazi Christianity. Awful thing. And so when we see President Trump waving a Bible about and threatening people with shooting, I recoil in horror, because he's using a symbol of all humanity in order to try and divide humanity. So let's go back to Abraham and Sarah, because Abraham was the father of many nations. So despite his faults and failings, despite Sarah's faults and failings, despite the faults and failings of the people that he gave birth to, and the Jewish confidence against the Gentiles, and the Gentiles fighting back against the Jews, actually God always intended people to be like Abraham in his faith and in his trust, in his willingness to go along with what God had in mind. And this is where we get to actually the more important point today, because when we feel that the world is in turmoil, when we feel that we don't know what the future holds, and I think that's pretty much how a lot of us are feeling today, the question is not, are we better than our neighbours? Because we're all the same, we all bleed. But the question is, do we continue to have hope that God is going to bring something good about? When Christianity started, that was a major shift in religion, not only for Christians but also for Jews. Judaism was never the same again. This pandemic and all the things that have spread from it is going to have a huge impact on what Christians do over the next year or so. We've been thinking as church communities about how we can start to open churches now that on Monday we're allowed to do so for private prayer. And we're thinking through very carefully, how can we do that safely? What does it mean to gather in that way as a group of Christians? How can we love one another as Jesus commanded within the confines of what social distancing means? And these are all new things. I mean, I have never ever in all my years of ministry been told you can't marry people, you can't baptize people, you can't give people communion. That is the first time I have been stopped from administering the sacraments, and it is deeply, deeply troubling. But do I have hope and faith that God is going to work something new out, some new way, or at least hopefully just a temporary way, but a new way of living together as Christians? We are all children of Abraham, sons of this father of the nations, and it's his faith in God that is our inheritance. That's what Paul actually picked out on in the letter to the Romans, in order to try and unite Jew and Gentile. So as we think about race, as we think about cultural identity, as we think about religious identity, let's focus on the positives of Abraham and Sarah. Yes, they were slave owners. Yes, they were brutal in how they treated Hagar and Ishmael. Yes, they were very, very flawed in trying to anticipate God's promises to them when God wasn't giving them a clear answer about how things were going to work out. And even when they get the message, you're going to have a son, Sarah laughs. That's why Isaac's called Isaac Yitzchak. It's a Hebrew word for laugh. And so God understands our reticence, our inability to take it all on board, because he knows we're human. But it's our humanity that unites us, that fear of the future, that perhaps lack of faith when faith grows dim. But we can all help each other with words of encouragement at this time. I don't know about you, but I've had conversations with people who are really, really feeling the hardship of the racist debate at the moment, because they are black. Their children are fearful to go out. And that hurts. That really hurts me. I don't have any solutions. But to acknowledge our common humanity and to share the hurt, to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn, that is something that perhaps is our first thing to do in this situation. Whether it's about race, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about anything else that people are hurting. Let's stick together. Let's be human. Let's care for each other as best we can. And let's be as creative as we can in how we go about that. Amen.